All right, hello everybody. Today we'll be talking about kinship and clan structure. As we talked about, kinship is very, very important for a lot of different societies. It's another cultural universal. And what I mean by that is that every culture has some version of kinship. And because that's the case, kinship, therefore, is really variable because every culture does it. Most cultures have a different way of doing it. Anthropologists realize that for both industrialized societies and pre-industrialized societies, kinship and your family is a major way to organize your society. And so anthropologists have really worked hard over the past 100 years to figure out the variety of kinship systems that peoples have and to figure out how they vary throughout from one culture to the next. So a descent group is any kin-ordered social group with a membership in direct line of descent from a real, historical, or fictional common ancestor. There are many ways to reckon descent groups to figure out who's in your descent group and who is not. You can have affinal kin, those who are in your kinship group based on marriage or other affinities, good friends, things like that. And then you can have sanguinal kin, those that are genetically or blood related to you, right? Both can be included in descent groups. Anthropologists divide descent groups in two major ways. They talk about bilateral or bilineal descent groups. This is what probably most of you in the room use, or most of you in the class, meaning that you consider both your mother's and your father's side of your family to be your family. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as the Eskimo system, which is a term I don't like because you should A, actually call those people Inuit. Eskimo means eaters of flesh. And B, I don't like calling it out as a specific culture, but you may see that reference somewhere, so I want to make sure you know that that term exists. And also, occasionally this is referred to as the cognitive system. I feel like that's somewhat ethnocentric, in that people will call bilineal or bilateral the thinking person's system. Essentially, this is what most westernized cultures do, and what most modern industrialized cultures do, as much as I don't like using the word modern. So that means that you consider both your mother's and your father's side of your family to be your family. That's not always the case, and in the past, often it was not the case. There's another subgroup of unilineal/unilateral kinship groups. That means that you consider descent to only go down one line, either the mother's or father's side. So within that group, we have matrilineal descent, descent down the mother's line, patrilineal descent, descent down the father's line, and the most confusing one of all, which is ambilineal descent. So people will get ambilineal and bilineal or bilateral confused. Bilateral and bilineal means both. Ambilineal means one at a time, but either, right? And so in these kinship systems, you are either in your mother's family or your father's family, and you can switch during your lifetime. Perhaps your mother's family offers you a better deal. Perhaps you need to switch to marry a certain person. Things like that. Lineages, however, are always exogamous, meaning that you have to marry outside your descent group or lineage. So bilineal or bilateral kinship means that you consider both your mother's and father's line to be related to you. It's also called the Eskimo system, as I mentioned. It's what probably most people in the class do. It's what cultures of North America tend to do. Typically, this features neo-local residence, meaning that when you get married and you become a phenol kin with somebody, you set up a new locality, a new house, neo-local place to live, just like we do in westernized culture. When you get married, your parents don't want you living in the house with them anymore, and so you tend to buy your own house, get your own apartment, or whatever. Examples of societies that live this way are most westernized cultures and the Inuit. So a matrilineal descent group is one that only considers the mother's family to be their kin. And remember that in these kinship charts, circles are female, triangles are male, and even though this chart doesn't show it, you should always specify an ego, because when you reference somebody in your family, you say, this is my brother. Your brother might be somebody else's dad. So remember that when you have to make these kinship charts, you should always have an ego. In this case, we can assume that ego is the central circle, the woman in the center, and all the people in blue would be in her matriline, and all the people in red would not be in her descent group. So if we think of the person that is above the center blue and to the left, the red triangle, that would normally be her father. She would not be related to her father in this type of descent. Matrilineal kinship systems have a couple effects on overall cultures and certainly family. Marriages tend to be weaker, as men have very little say in their wife's household. Often women own everything worth owning. Wives have to do very little to divorce their husbands. Amongst the Iroquois, which is the example culture we'll talk about, all a woman had to do was sit a man's stuff outside, and he was divorced. And then he would pick up his stuff and go to his mom's house. Often a child's father figure tends to be the mother's brother instead of the genetic father. That doesn't mean that the child doesn't know at all who the genetic father is, but instead that uncle will stand in place of the father, teach them any roles that are considered gender male, because that person is related to them through a woman. Inheritance, of course, goes down the female line, and anything that is done by males in the household is done by the mother's brother, not the father. Residence is matrilocal typically, but often married men might bounce back and forth between their wife's house and their mom's house, especially going to their mom's house if they're in trouble. So kind of the classic example of a culture that uses matrilineal descent are the Iroquois, the indigenous people of New York area here in North America. They lived in longhouses somewhat similar to the people of the Northwest Coast. And these longhouses and the farm fields that accompanied them were owned by women or a line of women. Typically, this resulted in women having quite a bit of power. Men often had power over certain things, but often women had the final say because they controlled the house and the food. For instance, there's a story about the Iroquois where the men had decided to go to war, and so they got all their war gear together, they made a plan, they did everything they needed to do, and all the women had gathered in a certain longhouse to do work and talk. And so the men ran into the longhouse very excited that they were going to go to war, and told the women this, and the women said, yeah, of course, warfare is your sphere of influence. You can go to war. You're very good at it. And the men said, great. Can we get effectively some packed lunches, or can we have some food to take with us? And the women said, well, no. And in that case, even though the women had been like, yeah, war's your thing, they had ultimate power because they could deny them access to food storage that they needed for the long walk to the enemy camp. And so in that case, while they placated the men and told them that they had power over warfare, in fact, they did not. Another major component to this is it's one of the many, many reasons that Europeans put forth that myth that Native Americans, which is a huge generalization, have no concept of ownership. One of the issues was when Europeans arrived to this area, they would say, hey, which man owns this land? And the men would be like, I don't own this land or this farm. And there is some woman in the background going, me and my sisters and my mother own this land. We've worked it for 100 years. And then Europeans would walk away going, see, nobody owns this land. And there's a woman in the background going, I do, right? And so that was one of the ways that they perpetrated that very harmful myth that indigenous people had no concept of ownership. And also remember that concepts of ownership among indigenous people, Native Americans, is not the same from group to group. So the Northwest Coast had that metaphoric right to resources that Europeans also really didn't understand. So in many cases, indigenous people didn't have a concept of ownership that was the same as Europeans, and Europeans took that to mean they had no concept of ownership, and therefore they could take lands away from them, which is very harmful if you intend to take lands away from people. So patrilineal descent is when you reckon descent down the male line. Often they do know who their matrilineal relatives are, and it's the same in a matrilineal system. They often know who their genetic father is and things like that. But it's that you only consider these people to be related to you. So in this case, if we considered the center triangle, that man, to be ego, then his dad is related to him, but his mom, pictured in white, is not. His sister's husband is not related to him, and his brother's wife is not related to him, nor is his wife's children in that case. Or I'm sorry, his sister's children. His wife's children are in his patriline. So basically, you can take a look at that. Remember, triangles are males, circles are females, and you can figure out those in white are not related to that person in a patrilineal system. Those in red are related to that person. So patrilineal systems have a couple of different effects. Often it is really bad in terms of gender stratification, meaning that women have a lot less rights in systems that have patrilineal systems. And most European westernized system had a patrilineal bent at the beginning. Any paternal uncles become like second fathers. Inheritance is down the male line. It often results in ancestor worships, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. Because in many ways, I make the argument, and some other anthropologists make the argument as well, that matrilineal descent is more natural because you really do know who your mom is, right? It only takes one person being there at your birth to figure out or remind you that when you were born, you came out of that lady. But patrilineal descent is somewhat more difficult to maintain because short of genetic testing, the only reason that you know who your dad is because everybody has decided that that was your dad. And everybody tells you that constantly, right? There's no witnessing of this baby coming out of this guy, for instance. So because of that, in patrilineal systems, to compensate for that, they will have people memorize their ancestry so that you know who all your male ancestors are. So if challenged, you can provide all the historical evidence to prove that you were related to this man who was related to this man who was related to this man. It's not always directly worship. The same is true in European nobility, in which inheritance ran down the male line, though they were still bilineal. You ended up with battlefield heraldry, right? For nobles, it was really important to know who was on what side in a battle, especially if you're nobility. So they had these shields that had icons on them. And they were forced to memorize these icons and who's related to who. So if they found themselves on one side of a battlefield or the other, they can look at a shield, go a hawk on a white background, and know they're supposed to fight that person and not fight the person with a lion on a red background or whatever. So often in patrilineal systems, and also, as we'll talk about here in a second, ambilineal systems, there's a lot of symbolic nature concerning kinship, and it's because it's confusing and people need to get it right. Matrilineal systems really, though they may have clans, and those clans may have icons, as we're about to talk about, there's very, well, less symbols concerning the matriline. People tend to know that. An example of that not being the case would be the Tlingit, but it happens. Anyway, so females are often married with dowries, which is really bad for gender stratification, meaning that when a woman gets married, she's basically being kicked out of her family. She is getting inheritance, and of course, often patrilocal, meaning living with the father's family, is the norm. So a classic example of patrilineal kinship is that of pre-communism Han Chinese, an ethnic group in China. Family membership was important, but the most important aspect of a kinship was a person's membership in its Sioux. The Sioux consists of men who trace their ancestry back through males to a common ancestor. Upon marriage, a woman was absorbed into a man's Sioux. And there's a really good example of this, and I really hate to use anything Disney related because often they take stories and change them and make them in some ways not true to the current form just to entertain people. However, that being said, in Mulan, when she goes into the shrine for ancestor worship, you can see all the different ancestors. They don't really manifest, but that is exactly what I'm talking about, that people were forced to memorize a line of men very far back in order to justify their membership in a patrilineal descent group. So students often find ambilineal societies to be the most confusing, and I think there's a good reason for that because ambilineal societies are somewhat confusing, and so confusing in fact that they often have many tricks and rules and symbols to keep track of who's in what family. So basically what this is a unilineal system, meaning that you are either in your mother's or your father's family. However, the thing that makes it ambilineal, either line, is that you can switch. So if you make one family mad, if you get offered a better, more important position in another family, if they need your skill set, if you need to move for marriage purposes, you can switch from one family to the other. And often ambilineal societies, like patrilineal societies, and a few matrilineal societies, have a lot of symbolism, meaning that they have clan totems, they have mythical symbols, they will be in the eagle clan, the raven clan, things like that. And it's an effort to keep everything straight. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about clans. An example of a group that lived this way traditionally is the Kwak Waka Wakwe. Sometimes you will hear them referred to as the Kwaki Udal. We try to avoid using that term now because it turns out that that meant the great enemy, and they prefer to be called the Kwak Waka Wakwe. So an example of that being that they have lots of clans, they have symbols, and people can move from one family to the other. Clans are one of my favorite aspects of kinship. They're extended unilineal descent groups, which claim common descent from a distant, often mythical ancestor. Clans do not have to share a residence, but often meet at certain times of the year to perform rituals and reaffirm their relationship. There can be so many people in a clan that you don't know them all, even though you may be a member. And if that's the case, often there are symbols to represent that clan such that you can recognize fellow clans people at a distance, right? So there might be so many people in your clan that you don't know them all, but you are related to them nonetheless. They can live together, but they don't have to. As I mentioned, some clans are so big that they only get together at certain times of the year, or so widespread that they only get together at certain times of the year. Clans are really common at the tribal political level. Remember, it's bands, tribes, chiefdom, state. Tribes are often groups of bands. Bands can then be organized into clans, and tribes can be organized into clans within those bands. Clan members, like I mentioned, may not even know each other, but often they wear some kind of iconography or symbol, allowing them to recognize each other, especially when there are lots of people in a given clan. So one of the classic non-totemistic clans are the clans of Scotland. The clans of Scotland still have a decent amount of political power. They're still recognized under British law, and I've got two examples of that. In World War II, there was a British commando, a lord of a clan, who went to war, and in doing so, he joined the British commandos. And he maintained the tradition that when a Scottish clan lord went to war, that his piper should go with him. And so in this case, his piper also joined the British commandos. However, his name was Macmillan, the piper. The Lord maintained that his piper shouldn't carry a weapon, that his goal in war, even in World War II, was to only carry the pipes, so that everywhere the Lord went as a captain of the British commandos, his pipes accompanied him. So this man, Macmillan, landed on the beach on D-Day, with only bagpipes. I think it was on Sword Beach. Now, keep in mind that these beach landings in Normandy were absolutely terrible. The German troops had set up bunkers with highly accurate machine guns, and these people were coming in on boats, running for any cover they could find, like tank traps, which were essentially just razor wire and a couple wooden boards set up in kind of something like a jack that you play with. And these people were trying to take cover, and this guy strides out onto the beach with the pipes, to reports not seeking any cover, and he survived the whole war. The British government would write often to this captain of the commandos, also Scottish lord, and say, it's come to our attention that there's a Sergeant Macmillan in your unit, and he doesn't carry a gun. That's against British military regulations. Please issue him a rifle. And the Scottish lord would simply write back, he's my clan's piper. When my clan goes to war, they bring the pipes, and that man will continue to do so. And so the British government never really forced him to pick up a rifle. The other example that I've never really been able to confirm, but I've heard it so many times that I think it's true. Feel free to check into it and make sure. But I've heard that Lord MacDonald basically sent a cease and desist to McDonald's, the multi-billion trillion dollar corporation. Effectively, a woman in his clan had opened a small cafe and called it McDonald's Cafe. And then she got a cease and desist letter from McDonald's, the mega corporation, that said, hey, we own that trademark. And then Lord McDonald supposedly sent McDonald's, the corporation, a letter that said, look, that's my name. I've been nice enough to let your corporation use it for many years. But if you ever threaten one of my clan members again, I will sue you under British law and I will win. And if that happens, be prepared to change the name of your franchise in the following countries: Britain, Ireland, Scotland, India, Canada, Australia, so on and so forth, right? All parts still loosely part of the British Commonwealth. And supposedly that little cafe is still named McDonald's Cafe to this day. So unlike Scottish clans, many clans, instead of picking a person, McDonald, McDougall, whatever, will pick an animal or a plant. This is called totinism. It's a special form of clan structure in which the clan claims to be related to some particular plant or animal or object. Examples of often used clan titles are raven, wolf, bear, turtle, something regarded as wise, fierce, clever. If you're in the bear clan, they might consider you somewhat of a berserker. If you're in the coyote clan, they might consider you somewhat of a trickster. Same with raven. If you're in the wolf clan, you might be wise, so on and so forth. That people may even think that you take on some of the aspects of that animal. Typically, as I mentioned, it's something with positive features. There's no manatee clan, for instance, that specialize in getting hit, sadly, by speedboats. But instead, often it's things that are fierce or wise. This is very common in animistic societies because they believe that animals, plants have spirits, and so emulating those spirits or telling stories about those spirits are very common. And so then a group of people identifying with one of those spirits or that animal makes a lot of sense. As I mentioned, clans often have a symbol. So there's the wolf clan on the left, and on the right is the clan mon of the Tokugawa clan, a clan that is very historically important to Japan. Tokyo is named after the Tokugawa clan. Tokugawa, the original, became shogun of Japan in the 17th century, and in many ways industrialized and led to the fall of the samurai, eventually during the Meiji later. But the point is, he's a very important clan and very important person in Japanese history. So this is where it gets a little confusing, and I only really tell you about Pleiades to make you aware of how complicated kinship can be. Pleiade, same root word as fraternity, though one spelled with an F, one with a PH. A Pleiade is a unilineal descent group composed of at least 2 or more clans. Supposedly these 2 clans share a common ancestry. So wolves and bears might be in the same Pleiade, while frogs and toads might be in the same Pleiade, something like that. So it's 2 clans that are grouped up into a common descent group. Pleiades are also exogamous, so if wolf and bear are in a Pleiade together and I'm a wolf and I find a cute girl from the bear clan, I cannot marry her because she is in the same Pleiade as me. So essentially, Pleiades are just groups of related clans. Moieties are also groups of related clans, but unlike Pleiades, when a clan structure is in a moiety system, there are only 2 moieties, always 2, never more, never less. Often these 2 moieties are nighttime animals, daytime animals, land animals, sea animals. They will be opposed to each other. So moieties, always 2 groups. You can have a group of clans that have both Pleiades and moieties, but essentially it is a big group of clans that figure they are related. So in our example, we can say that wolf, bear, tiger, and badger are all land animals, so they're all in one moiety, while dolphin, turtle, fish, and salmon, specific fish, are all in another moiety, right? And so the big deal about moieties is they are exogamous, but if I'm in the land animal moiety, not only can I not marry somebody in the land animal moiety, but I have to marry somebody in the sea animal moiety. Moieties are really common. A lot of cultures that had no contact in the modern era all kind of developed this moiety system as well. So it's either just a really good idea or it's a very, very old idea that has changed somewhat through human evolution. But we find that several different cultures that had no contact until recent times all have a very similar system. Also, in many moiety systems, the two moieties are somewhat competitive. So that one will try to outdo the other. So it's basically having a sports team built into your society. So they might competitively potlatch. They might have games in which they compete with each other. They might try to outdo each other. But in the end, you know you're going to marry somebody from the other moiety, so it kind of limits how awful you can be. So it's this kind of internal conflict system that encourages everybody to do better, but you know that you can't do something terribly horrible at risk of not being able to marry somebody or making the other moiety mad that you've already married into or have somebody or no relatives who exist in it. So it's basically this internal division in a society that kind of encourages competition so everybody does better. It's pretty clear who you're going to marry, that you're going to not marry somebody from your moiety, marry somebody from the other moiety, so on and so forth. So it's this dichotomy that kind of splits society in two. So I built this chart to show you how complicated moieties and phraedes and kinship in general can be. So for instance, if I was in the lineage in the bottom left, I could be in the Williams lineage, in the wolf clan, in the wolf and bear phraedy, and in the land animal moiety, right? And then I could find somebody who was in the Richardson lineage, in the badger clan, in the small land animal phraedy, and realize that they are also in the land animal moiety, and realize I can't marry them, right? But if I'm lucky and I live in an ambilineal society, I might be able to switch to my mom's moiety or my dad's moiety and then make that person marriageable by switching. So the point is that this version of kinship can be very, very complicated. You can have moieties, phraedes, clans, and lineages all within the same system. And often when kinship is this complicated, people will come up with symbols and shortcuts so that everybody knows who's related to who can marry who, so on and so forth. So we've gone over how cultural anthropologists understand and see kinship, but what about archaeologists? It's actually really difficult for archaeologists to do cultural anthropology and see kinship, but I'm going to suggest a few sites where you might be able to do that. So we will look at the site I call Poverty Point again to kind of show how this might happen. Here we have an artist reconstruction of Poverty Point, and though we don't know for certain, this could be divisions based on bands, clans, phraedes, and possibly even moieties. So for instance, you consider each pie slice, like this one, as a clan, and then this one as a separate clan, and then this one as a separate clan, and maybe everything from here over, down this line, and over this way, is a moiety, for instance, and then the other side over there is a second moiety. If you kind of think about it that way, if you look at settlement patterns and things like that, you might be able to tease out kinship from archaeological sites, but it's actually really, really difficult to do. We assume often that people had similar kinship systems to what we see in the ethnographic present, but that's somewhat dangerous. But this is just a small kind of commentary on how you might see kinship in the archaeological record, but in fact, it's actually really, really difficult. So that's all I've got for this kinship lecture. Be sure to check out any other lectures concerning kinship before or after this, and of course, email me if you have any questions. Thanks very much.